And today we continue now. We get back to our series of sermons on the questions of Jesus, not the questions that we asked, but the questions that Jesus asked. And we're coming near the end of that. And today we come to this particular incident where some of the religious authorities of his time came to Jesus, and in an attempt to trick him into saying something, or at least getting him into a position where he really was going to have a hard time making a decision between two choices, they come to him with this question about taxes. Now, at that time, let's understand, first of all, that Jesus lived in very political times. We think we live in political times today. It was no different in his day. Jesus lived in a very political climate. And make no mistake about it, Jesus was a political person. You'll hear people today say, let's not bring politics into the church. I think I know what people mean by that, but the fact of the matter is that Jesus never shied away from politics. And in fact, Jesus ultimately was crucified because of politics. Jesus was a very political creature. He never shied away from it. And the church today should never shy away from politics. Now, I understand what most people mean when they say keep politics out of the church. We shouldn't debate Republican and, I'm Democrat, all that kind of stuff. But the church does and has to be political. And so when they came to Jesus with a very political question. Jesus lived in a time when his part of the world was under the domination of another people. He was living under oppression. The Roman government was oppressing the people of Palestine. And they were making great demands upon the people of Palestine. And we can understand today what it would be like if some foreign government took over the United States and was telling us what we could do and what we couldn't do, was taking our taxes from us for their purposes. We wouldn't stand for it. And there were people at the time of Jesus who couldn't stand for it. And there were people at the time of Jesus who said we need to resist this oppression, this occupation. And so the religious leaders, and the other thing we need to understand is that the religious hierarchy at the time of Jesus was very much entwined with the governing officials. They had a lot at stake, and to protect themselves, there was many ways in which they succumbed to the Roman Empire. So they came to Jesus with this question about taxes, which seemed like, well, in our day and age, you pay your taxes and so on and so forth. But at that time, it was a huge issue. Should you pay your taxes to Rome or not? Or should you, as a sign of resistance, refuse to pay your taxes? Now, coming to Jesus with this question put him in a bind. Should we pay our taxes or not? Yes or no? Which way do you say, Jesus? Well, if he said, no, we should not pay our taxes to Rome, they could have immediately gone to the Roman authorities and said, you have a man here who is preaching sedition. He's telling people not to pay their taxes. That's against the law. Jesus would immediately have been arrested. But what if he said, yes, you should pay your taxes? Well, many of his followers were of the opinion that Jesus was there to stand up against the Roman Empire, and if he had said, yeah, you go ahead and pay your taxes, he would have lost much of his following. So they thought they had him in a trap. They thought they had him between a rock and a hard place. How could he say yes? How could he say no with getting himself in trouble one way or the other? Well, we all know how the story ends. Jesus asks for a coin. And then he asks the question, which is the question of today. He says, why put me to the test? Bring me a coin. And they bring him a coin. He looks at the coin and says, whose likeness and inscription is this? Whose head is there on this coin? Well, in those days, it was kind of a sign of oppression that the Caesar would put his own image on the coins. And there was kind of a dual purpose behind that. But one of the purposes was to say, this money belongs to me. Everything you have really belongs to me. So it's not so much the fact that I'm asking you to pay taxes, it's also the fact that I'm allowing you to keep a little bit for yourself. And the taxes weren't that hard. I think it was like 1% tax on what they owned, and there was a head tax that all the grown men and grown women had to pay, and there were a few other taxes. It wasn't so much how much they had to pay, but the fact they did have to pay. But the coin was always a reminder of who was in charge. So Jesus looks at the coin, he says, whose image is this? And they had to say, well, it's Caesar's. Well, in point of fact, this money belongs to Caesar. So give it back. Give it to Caesar. Give him the things that belong to him, and give God the things that belong to God. The question that Jesus asked was a question of authority. Whose authority governs your life? And it's a question that is as relevant today as it was at the time of Jesus. It's a question of the state and the church. And rather than using the word church, I at times prefer to use the word the kingdom of God. Now, sometimes the institutional church, as I mentioned at the time of Jesus, but the religious authorities, but even throughout the history of the church, sometimes the church, the institutional church, has become so intertwined with government, with the governing authorities, that you could barely tell the two apart. And there's a danger in that. I just want to mention the danger in that. I just finished reading a book about Haiti, and during some of the more tumultuous times in Haiti, and there's always been tough times in Haiti, one of the sad things is that under some of the most oppressive dictators, the church, the institutional church, the leaders of the church were never willing to speak out against the atrocities that were committed against people, partly in order to protect themselves. In order to protect what they had to submit to the government and be quiet. It was usually the priests out in the countryside who were the ones who caused trouble and would raise issues about the government, and those priests were either suddenly disappearing at night and their bodies showing up someplace else, or the church itself would just defrock them and send them back to Rome or wherever. But too often in the history of the 2,000-year history of the church has become too intertwined with the government to be the church. There needs to be a separation of the two, and we talk a lot about that in our culture today, separation of church and state. But for me, what that really means is that the church cannot become so identified with a certain political ideology. The church cannot become so identified with the Democrats or with the Republicans, for instance, that it can no longer become a prophetic voice. We need to be very careful. It's not to say that we can't, as individuals, have political ideologies. But as a church, we need to be careful that we do not become so enmeshed in a particular ideology that we cannot stand apart and be a prophetic voice. And the role of the church, I believe, in the world today, as it has been for 2,000 years, is to be a prophetic voice, to be able and willing to speak out when there is oppression, when there is injustice, and when the government becomes unfair. We need to be able to speak out. And sometimes we become, in particular parts of the church, and particular individuals within the church have become so close to some of the political leadership of our country. You know how it is when you're really close to someone. It's hard to tell them the truth at times. And the church needs to be separate enough from the government to be able to be that voice of prophecy, to be the prophetic voice that it needs to be. And yet we need the government. So that's the issue we want to face today. We want to talk about what is our role as a church, what is our role as individual Christians in the midst of a political environment. And I want to go now to 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verse 13. The first letter of Peter in the back, way in the back, and it's the 2nd chapter, the 13th verse, where the author of this letter says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong, and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Live as free men, yet without using your freedom as a pretext for evil, but live as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." So the author here of Peter indicates that the government, even at their time, was instituted by God. So we have this issue that we're told in Scripture that governments are placed in their position by God. So what does that mean for us? Because that can be abused. What does it mean for us to live in this world as citizens of God's kingdom, but also citizens of this world and living under human institutions, human governments? So that's what I want to talk a little bit about this morning. And I want to talk about, again, the Scriptures tell us that the state is ordained by God. Now, why would God ordain a government? Well, there's some very obvious reasons why we need governments. We need governments to determine what the laws will be. Can you imagine without any laws what life would be like? If I could set my own laws, and you could set your own laws, human nature would say that my laws would be set to benefit me, not you. And your laws would be set to benefit you and not me, and that would create all kinds of chaos. Governments have been established to determine laws and to prevent chaos. And so we have a government that we live under that has established laws. Now, sometimes we may disagree with those laws. We may sometimes think that those laws have gone too far. But we also understand that there needs to be laws. There needs to be something that brings order to society, to culture, to our community. And so God has ordained that there should be some authority that would establish that, and it takes various forms throughout the world, different kinds of governments, but all governments ultimately are responsible